She didn't even look up from the ledger when she said it. Martha Greer, the outgoing station clerk, the woman Clara Winslow was hired to replace, leaned across the front counter on Clara's very first morning and said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, "That one over there? Don't bother with him. He comes every Friday, sits on that bench like a tombstone, and doesn't spend a dime past his 5-cent ticket. Waste of a seat." She said it with the flat certainty of a woman who had decided long ago what things were worth. Clara glanced toward the platform window. Through the rain-blurred glass, she could see the shape of a man, broad-shouldered, still, hat pulled low, sitting alone on the far bench like he had grown there. Something about the way he sat made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't name. If that were me, she thought, would anyone bother to ask? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. These are the kinds of stories that stay with you. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, leave a like. It only takes a second, and it means everything. Now, let's go back to Blackstone Crossing, Kansas. 1885. And a man who kept a promise no one else could see. The 5-cent ticket was always crisp. That was the first thing Clara Winslow noticed on her second Friday at Blackstone Crossing Station. Not the mud on the man's boots, not the threadbare collar of his coat, not the way his hands rested on his knees like two closed books. It was the ticket, perfectly unfolded, pressed flat against his palm like he'd smoothed it out the night before. Nobody bought a platform ticket and kept it neat. Platform tickets were things you crumpled in your fist or stuffed in a vest pocket and forgot about. They cost 5 cents. They meant nothing. You bought them, you stood on the platform, you left. But Gideon Ashcroft, though Clara didn't know his name yet, treated his ticket like it was a deed to something. She'd been watching him from the clerk's window for 20 minutes, which she knew was not professional behavior for a woman on her second week of employment. The morning rush had thinned. The eastbound hadn't arrived yet. The rain was still coming down in that particular Kansas way. Not dramatic, not violent, just relentless. The kind of rain that didn't care whether you had somewhere to be. And the man on the bench didn't move. Not once. Clara had grown up in a household where stillness was something you earned through exhaustion. Her mother, in the last 2 years of her life, had been still because she couldn't be otherwise. Her father had been still in the weeks after her mother passed because grief had taken the movement out of him like a hand squeezing water from a cloth. Clara knew what stillness born of sadness looked like. It had lived in her own house for the better part of a decade. This man had it. Whatever it was. She shouldn't have gone out there. She had ledgers to update, 2 parcels to log, and a broken stamp pad that needed attention. She had any number of sensible reasons to stay behind the counter where she belonged. She picked up the coffee pot. The platform was cold. The overhang kept most of the rain off, but the wind came sideways and Clara felt it cut straight through her wool jacket as she pushed through the side door and stepped out onto the boards. The wood was dark with moisture. Her shoes made a soft, wet sound with every step. The man didn't look up. Up close, he was older than she'd estimated through the window. Somewhere in his mid-50s, she thought, though hard outdoor life had a way of adding years to a face without diminishing the person behind it. His jaw was square and unshaven by 2 or 3 days. His hat was a working man's hat, not a gentleman's, and the crease in it had long since given up the fight. His coat had been good quality once. Clara could tell by the cut of it, even now. She stopped about 3 feet from the bench. He still hadn't looked at her. "Coffee?" she said. It was not her most eloquent opening. She was aware of that. He looked up then. His eyes were gray. Not the dramatic silver gray of romantic novels, just plain gray, the color of sky before weather, and they moved over her face with a kind of careful slowness, like a man who had learned not to be surprised by things, but hadn't quite gotten used to it yet. "I didn't order any," he said. "No," Clara agreed. It's cold out, and I made too much, and I hate waste." She paused. "That's not entirely true. I made the right amount. I just thought you might want some." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Not quite. But the careful blankness loosened around the edges just a fraction. "Thank you," he said, and took the cup. She should have gone back inside. She knew that. The eastbound was still 20 minutes out, minimum, and she had those parcels to log. She turned halfway, then stopped. "I'm Clara Winslow," she said. "I took over from Martha Greer 2 weeks ago." "I know," he said. "Small town." "Right." She waited a half second. "I'm sorry, I don't know your Gideon Ashcroft." She nodded. He looked back toward the tracks, and that should have been the end of it. A brief, unremarkable exchange between a station clerk doing something kind and a customer who was minding his own business. Clara could have walked back inside, ticked the interaction off as basic human decency, and gotten on with her afternoon. Instead, she heard herself say, "Who are you waiting for?" The silence that followed was not brief. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind you feel against your sternum, pressing. Gideon Ashcroft looked down at the coffee cup in his hands, and Clara watched something move behind his face. Not emotion exactly, more like the approach of emotion, the way you can see a storm on the horizon before you feel any wind. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "That's none of my business. I shouldn't have—" "My wife," he said. Clara stopped. Her name was Rosalie. He said the name the way people say names that belong to the dead, with a careful gentleness, like the word itself might break. She used to come home on this train, every Friday, without fail. She had family in Lawrence, a sister, 2 nephews. She'd go every month or so, help out when the sister needed an extra pair of hands. The nephews were young. It was a lot of work. He paused and turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. She always took the early Thursday train out and came back on the Friday afternoon eastbound. Always. Never missed it. Clara didn't speak. She understood instinctively that speaking would be the wrong thing. "She'd come off the train," Gideon continued, "and she'd see me sitting right here and she'd—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at the tracks. "She'd run. Woman in her 40s, 2 bags in her hands, and she'd run the length of that platform like a girl." A brief sound escaped him that wasn't quite a laugh. "Used to embarrass me. I'd tell her to slow down. She'd tell me she didn't care who was watching." He was quiet for a moment. "I stopped telling her to slow down pretty quickly." Clara sat down. She didn't plan to. Her knees simply made the decision without consulting the rest of her. "When did she pass?" she asked, and her voice came out softer than she intended. 3 years ago, February." He said it with the flatness of someone who has counted the times so many times the number has lost its ability to wound. Almost. "Heart. Very sudden. She was in Lawrence visiting her sister when it happened. They telegraphed me." He paused. "The telegram came on a Thursday. She was supposed to be on the Friday train." Clara closed her eyes for just a moment. "So you come here," she said, "every Friday afternoon." Because this is the last place she felt real to me." He said it plainly. Not with self-pity, not with the performance of grief that Clara had seen from men who wanted to be noticed being sad. Just the plain, blunt fact of it. At home, she's everywhere, but it's like she's faded into the walls, you understand? Every place has so many memories that none of them are sharp anymore. But here, he looked at the far end of the platform, where the tracks curved out of sight toward the east. "Here I know exactly what happened. I sat on this bench, and she ran to me, and that was it. That was the whole thing, and I can still see it." Clara thought of her father standing in the kitchen doorway the morning after her mother's funeral, looking at the stove like it was written in a language he'd forgotten. "Yes," she said quietly. "I understand." He looked at her then, really looked the way he hadn't when she'd first approached him. "You've lost someone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Both parents," she said. "My mother 4 years ago, my father last spring." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I spent so long taking care of them that when it was over, I didn't quite know what to do with—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. This isn't about me." "You brought me coffee," Gideon said, "in the rain. It can be a little bit about you." And there it was. Not a smile exactly, but something close enough to it that Clara found the tight thing in her chest loosening just slightly. The eastbound came in at 3:47. It was 7 minutes late, which was not unusual. The locomotive came in loud and steaming and indifferent, the way trains did, filling the platform with noise and movement and the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. People poured off. People pushed on. Bags were dragged. Children were called. A dog on a rope barked at nothing and everything. Gideon Ashcroft watched it all with the same gray-eyed stillness. Clara watched him watch it. She saw the moment the last passenger came off the train. She saw him track the final exit door with his eyes. She saw what passed over his face when no one else appeared. Not surprised, because he had known for 3 years that no one would appear, but something that was harder than surprise. Something that had to be gone through rather than over every single Friday, like a door with no latch that you had to push through with your whole body. Then it passed. He folded the 5-cent ticket and put it in his breast pocket, stood with the slowness of a man whose knees had strong opinions about cold weather, and picked up his hat from the bench beside him. "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Winslow," he said. "Clara," she said. He considered this. "Clara," he said, and the words sounded somehow different in his voice than in anyone else's. More considered, like he was being careful with it. He walked to the platform steps, descended, and was gone into the gray afternoon. Clara sat alone on the bench for a long moment. The train was pulling out. Steam drifted back across the platform. The noise faded, and then there was just the rain again. Still coming down, still not caring, and the empty tracks curving east toward Lawrence, toward Kansas City, toward everything that was not Blackstone Crossing. She thought about a woman running down this platform with 2 bags in her hands. She thought about a man who kept coming back to watch the place where that had happened, week after week after week, because the alternative was forgetting the sharpness of it. She didn't want to go back inside just yet. The next Friday, Clara made 2 cups. She didn't examine the decision too closely. Examining it would have made it into something larger than she was ready for. It was just coffee. It was just cold outside. It was just a man who sat alone on a bench and had been kind enough to speak honestly to a stranger who'd had no business asking. She set his cup on the bench before he arrived and went back inside. She did not watch from the window, mostly. When the eastbound came in at 3:53, 6 minutes late this time, she allowed herself one glance toward the platform. He was there. The coffee cup was in his hands. He was watching the train. He didn't look toward the window. She didn't expect him to. But when the last passenger had come off the train and Gideon Ashcroft stood and put on his hat, he paused at the top of the platform steps. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out something small, she couldn't see what, and set it carefully on the arm of the bench. Then he descended the steps and rode away. Clara waited until she was sure he was gone before she went out to look. It was a folded piece of paper. She opened it. "Thank you," it said. Nothing else. She stood on the cold platform holding a piece of paper with 2 words on it, and she felt something she hadn't felt in such a long time that she almost didn't recognize it. She felt like she was somewhere she was supposed to be. It was the middle of October when things got complicated. Not between them. There was no them yet. Not in any way that could be named. They'd shared maybe 4 full conversations by then, spread across 6 Fridays, mostly about nothing in particular. Whether the winter was coming early, it was. Whether the new grain shipment at the Mercantile was any good, it wasn't. Whether the mayor's plan to extend the main road past Miller's Creek made any practical sense, it did not. Simple things, frontier things. The kind of conversation that doesn't reveal anything important and somehow reveals everything. The complication came from Ed Harlow. Ed Harlow was Gideon's neighbor, a rancher in his own right, though not as successful, a fact that had apparently been a source of ongoing irritation for Ed Harlow since approximately 1871. He came into the station on a Wednesday, which was not his usual day for anything, and he leaned against Clara's counter with the ease of a man who has decided that spaces belong to him until proven otherwise. "Saw you talking to Gideon Ashcroft last Friday," he said, without preamble. Clara looked up from the freight ledger. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Harlow?" "Just making conversation." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that was doing several things at once, none of them entirely friendly. "Gideon's a funny one. Has been since Rosalie passed. You know he's still not over that woman? 3 years? And the man's still coming here every week like she's going to walk off that train." "I wasn't aware that grief had a deadline," Clara said. Ed Harlow's smile adjusted. "Just saying, a woman in your position, new in town, on your own, you might want to think carefully about where you put your attention. Gideon Ashcroft's got a ranch that's been losing ground for 2 years and a heart that's still buried with his dead wife." He tilted his head. "Might not be the most promising investment." Clara set down her pen. She looked at Ed Harlow for a moment, at his self-satisfied ease, his assumption that this was a useful thing to say to another person, the way he seemed genuinely puzzled by the possibility that his advice might not be welcome. Were you needing a ticket, she said, or a freight receipt, or anything that would actually require me to be standing here? Ed Harlow straightened. Just being neighborly. Said Clara. Thank you for stopping by. He left. Clara picked up her pen again. Her hand was not entirely steady. The anger was there, clean and hot. But underneath it was something else. Something Ed Harlow hadn't intended to put there. Because he'd said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, like it was simply known. Gideon Ashcroft's heart is still buried with his dead wife. And Clara had to sit with the sudden, uncomfortable awareness that she had no idea whether that was true. She almost didn't go out on the next Friday. She stood behind the counter at 3:15 with the coffee pot in her hand and had a full, silent argument with herself about it. She was a practical woman. She had come to Blackstone Crossing to work, to build something small and functional from the wreckage of her previous life, not to develop, whatever this was. Habits, attachments, things with no clear name. Gideon Ashcroft was still in love with his dead wife. That was not a criticism. That was simply the fact of him, like his gray eyes and his worn coat and his careful way of saying her name. And Clara Winslow had spent the last 4 years pouring everything she had into people who were leaving, and she did not think she had enough left to pour into a grief she could never reach the bottom of. These were sensible thoughts. She went out anyway. He was already there when she pushed through the side door. Earlier than usual, he was sitting forward on the bench with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and she saw immediately that something was wrong. Not grief wrong. Something new. Sit down, he said before she could speak. She sat. Lost 23 head this week, he said. Sickness. Spread through the south pasture before I knew what it was. Might lose more. Clara didn't say she was sorry. She sensed that was not what he needed. What kind? She asked. He told her. She didn't know enough about cattle disease to be genuinely useful, but she listened in the way that she'd learned to listen during her parents' illnesses, not waiting for a pause so she could say the right thing, but actually taking in what was being said and letting it matter. He talked for a long time, about the ranch, about the years he and Rosalie had built it, about what it would mean to lose it now. She'd tell me to stop catastrophizing, he said eventually, with a short, dry sound that was the closest she'd heard him come to a laugh. She always said I borrowed trouble from next week when I had plenty of my own for today. She sounds like she was very wise, Clara said. She was smarter than me, he said simply. That was never a question. He looked at the tracks again. The eastbound was late today, nearly 15 minutes, which was unusual. How did you do it? He said. Clara glanced at him. Do what? Keep going, after your parents. He turned his hat in his hands once more. I mean the first part. The part where you get up in the morning and there's just nothing requiring you to. No one waiting on you. Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow or next week or never. He paused. How did you get through that part? Clara thought about it honestly. Badly, she said. He looked at her. I did it badly, she said. I got up because I had to, not because I wanted to. I ate because forgetting to eat made me feel worse, not because I was hungry. I took this job because staying in my parents' house was becoming dangerous, I think. For my ability to remember that I still had a life. She looked down at her hands. I cried in a supply closet twice in my first week here. I still don't always know what I'm doing or why. She paused. I don't think there's a good way through it. I think you just go through it, and it's bad, and then one day it's slightly less bad, and that has to be enough. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in 3 years, he said. Everyone else tell you it gets easier? Everyone else tells me Rosalie's in a better place. He said it without bitterness, but without warmth either. Like that's supposed to help. Like the point was ever about where she was, and not about where I am without her. The eastbound came in then, its whistle cutting across the afternoon, and they both went quiet in the way that had become natural between them. A comfortable silence while the world got loud around them, neither of them needing to fill it. Clara watched the passengers come off. She did not watch Gideon watch them. She watched instead the far end of the platform, the curve in the tracks, the place where a train would first come into view. She tried to imagine seeing someone you loved appear from around that curve, week after week, with bags in their hands and a run in their step, and no interest whatsoever in what anyone else thought about it. She thought it must have been extraordinary to be run toward like that. She thought it must be an extraordinary thing to lose. The eastbound pulled out at 4:22. Neither of them moved immediately. The platform was quiet again. The rain had stopped finally, though the boards were still dark with it. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. The lamplight in the station window made a yellow rectangle on the platform boards, and Clara sat inside the edge of it, close enough to feel its warmth. "Ed Harlow came by the station," she said. She hadn't planned to say it, but the words were there and they came out. Gideon's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. "What did he want?" "To warn me off, I think," Clara said. "He mentioned your ranch losing ground. He mentioned—" She stopped, because the next part was harder to say. "He mentioned that you're still in love with your wife." The silence after that had a different quality than their usual ones. "Is that what he said?" Gideon said. Not a question. "In so many words." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the hat in his hands, once, twice. Then he stopped turning it and set it on his knee and looked at it. "Ed Harlow," he said, "has been trying to buy my south pasture for 4 years. He figures if the ranch goes under, he can get it cheap from whoever settles the estate." He paused. "He's not wrong that I'm in a bad position. He is wrong about—" He stopped, picked up his hat, set it on his head. "He's wrong about some things." He didn't say which things. Clara didn't ask, but she thought about it on the walk back inside. She thought about it when she tallied the day's ledger and found 2 addition errors she had to go back and fix. She thought about it when she locked the station door at 5:30 and walked home through streets that still smelled like rain. She thought about the 5-cent ticket, always pressed flat. She thought about a woman running down a platform with 2 bags in her hands. She thought about a man who called that running embarrassing and then stopped saying so because it turned out he didn't want it to stop. And she thought about herself, a woman who had spent so long being needed that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply be wanted, who had taken a job in a strange town not because she was brave, but because staying still had started to feel like slowly disappearing. She thought, "I don't know what this is." She thought, "I don't know if it's anything at all." She thought, "But I'm going to keep making 2 cups of coffee on Friday afternoons, and I'm going to keep going out onto that cold platform, and I'm going to keep sitting next to him while the train comes and goes. Not because it's wise, not because it's safe, but because it's the only thing in my life right now that feels like it might be worth the cold." November came to Blackstone Crossing the way it always did, without apology. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night sometime in the first week, and by the second week the ground had gone hard, and the sky had taken on that particular flat white quality that old-timers recognized as the prairie's way of clearing its throat before winter said something serious. The cottonwoods along the creek road lost their leaves in 2 days. The mud on Main Street froze into ridges that caught wagon wheels and turned ankles, and people stopped lingering on their porches and started moving with purpose, heads down, breath clouding. Clara noticed all of this the way she noticed most things now. From the station window, in between tasks, with the particular attention of a person who is new somewhere and is still learning what the place looks like when it means business. She had been in Blackstone Crossing for 2 months. She had learned that the morning freight came in 7 minutes late on average, and that this was considered on time. She had learned that the station master, a quiet man named Howard Briggs, took his lunch at 11:30 without variation, and that interrupting this was inadvisable. She had learned that the town had 2 kinds of people, those who knew everything about everyone and said so, and those who knew everything about everyone and didn't. The second kind were generally more dangerous. She had also learned that Gideon Ashcroft's ranch was called Ashcroft Flats, that it ran approximately 400 acres of mixed grazing land east of town, and that it had been built from essentially nothing by a man and a woman who had arrived in Kansas in 1867 with less than $60 between them and a combined stubbornness that apparently could not be measured in any standard unit. She had learned this from Ruth Kavanaugh, who ran the dry goods store and who had known Rosalie Ashcroft since before she was Rosalie Ashcroft. Clara had not sought out this information. It had found her, the way information about people always found you in small towns. Through the sideways drift of conversation, through the things people said while you were doing something else, through the accumulated weight of small comments that added up to a portrait whether you were trying to paint one or not. She used to come in here every Wednesday morning, Ruth had said, while measuring out flour and not quite looking at Clara. Rosalie. Regular as the mail, she'd buy the same things, more or less, but she'd always find something new to talk about. That woman could find something interesting in a list of fence posts. Ruth had tied off the flour sack with practiced efficiency. Gideon was quieter, even then, but you could see it, the way he'd come in sometimes if she was here. He'd pretend he needed something, some hardware thing, a nail or a hinge, but he'd just come in to see what she was laughing about. Clara had carried that image home with her, a younger Gideon Ashcroft pretending to need a hinge. It sat inside her chest in a way she didn't entirely examine. The Fridays kept coming. The third week of November, Clara arrived at the platform to find that Gideon had beaten her there again, and this time he wasn't alone. There was a young man with him, early 20s, with Gideon's same jaw and none of his stillness, standing beside the bench and talking with the rapid, pressured energy of someone delivering bad news and hoping speed would make it smaller. Clara stopped in the doorway. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shape of the conversation easily enough. The young man's hands were moving, Gideon's weren't. The young man kept looking sideways, toward the street, toward the exit, the way people looked when they wanted to be done with something. Gideon was looking at the tracks. She turned to go back inside. "Miss Winslow." Gideon's voice carried clearly across the platform. She turned back. He was looking at her now. "Don't go in on my account," he said. "This is my nephew Thomas." He was just leaving. Thomas turned and looked at her with the vaguely startled expression of a man who had not expected an audience. He was handsome in an unfinished way, like a sketch that hadn't been fully committed to. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, and then, to Gideon, with a lowered voice that still carried, "Think about what I said. That's all I'm asking." "I've thought about it," Gideon said. "Uncle? Thomas." That was all, just the name. But something in the way he said it closed the conversation the way you'd close a door. Not a slam, just a firm, final click. Thomas Ashcroft descended the platform steps without looking back. Clara watched him go, then crossed the platform and set the coffee cup on the bench arm. She sat down. "I don't need to know," she said. "He wants me to sell," Gideon said. She hadn't expected him to say it that quickly. He was looking at the tracks again. "The ranch?" she said. "The whole thing. House, land, livestock, whatever's left of the livestock." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The steam rose between his fingers. "He says I'm throwing good money after bad. Says the cattle disease is going to take another 50 head before spring, maybe more, and that I should cut my losses before there are no losses left to cut." "Is he right?" Clara asked. "About the cattle?" A pause. "Probably." "But you're not going to sell." It wasn't a question. She could hear the answer already in the flat, tired certainty of his voice. "It's not just land," he said. "It's not just—" He stopped. Started again. "Rosalie's kitchen garden is still there. She planted it in the spring of 1871. She spent 3 years getting the soil right. The herbs she put in the south corner, they still come up every year. Every single year, whether I tend them or not, they come back." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that sounds foolish." "It doesn't," Clara said. "Thomas thinks it does." "Thomas isn't wrong that you're in trouble," she said carefully. "But Thomas is also 23 years old, and I don't think 23-year-olds fully understand yet that some things are worth more than their price." Gideon looked at her. "That might be the most direct thing you've said to me," he said. "I've been practicing," she said. The almost smile appeared. It was becoming familiar to her now, that almost smile. The slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes changed quality without quite committing to warmth. She had started to look for it the way you look for certain constellations, not always there, but unmistakable when they were. The eastbound was on time for once, coming in at 3:49 with its usual noise and indifference. They watched it together. The passengers came off. A family with too much luggage, a traveling salesman with a sample case, an older woman being helped down the steps by the conductor. No one ran. Gideon watched the platform empty out with the same gray-eyed steadiness he always did. Clara watched him. She was getting better at reading what the watching cost him. It wasn't the same every week. Some weeks it was a low, manageable thing, like a sore that had mostly healed. Other weeks, she couldn't always tell why. It hit him harder, and the line of his shoulders afterward was different, and he'd be slower getting up from the bench, and the ride home would take him longer than it should have. This was one of the harder weeks. She could see it in the moment the last passenger came off the train. Something moved behind his face, brief and unguarded, before he put it away again. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. She didn't have anything prepared. She hadn't planned to speak. But she had spent too long watching grief from the outside, her mother's, her father's, her own. And she had learned that sometimes the most honest thing you could offer another person was simply to refuse to look away. "I'm glad you're still here," she said, "in Blackstone Crossing. I'm glad you didn't sell and go somewhere else." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm glad you brought coffee," he said finally. Which was not, she thought, nothing. The train pulled out. He stood, put on his hat, and said goodnight. She watched him walk to the platform steps, and she noticed, for the first time, or perhaps for the first time consciously, that he moved like a man who was used to carrying weight. Not badly, not beaten down, just accustomed to it. The way certain trees grew along the Kansas creek beds, bent by prevailing wind into a permanent lean, still rooted, still standing, shaped by the thing that pressed against them. She stayed on the bench a little longer than usual after he left. The lamplight in the station window had come on while they were talking, and it made the platform look different, warmer, more defined, the yellow light drawing a sharp border between itself and the dark. Somewhere down the street a door opened and closed. A horse shook its head against the cold. Clara pulled her coat tighter and thought about herb gardens that came back every year without tending. She thought about what it meant to plant something so well that it outlasted you. She thought that Rosalie Ashcroft must have been a remarkable woman, and that this thought, which should have felt discouraging, somehow didn't. The December cold settled in over the next 2 weeks with the comprehensive commitment of a house guest who has decided to stay indefinitely. The water troughs at the livery froze solid by morning and had to be broken with a hammer before the horses could drink. The station waiting room, which had never been particularly warm, became the coldest indoor space in Blackstone Crossing, a distinction it held through Christmas and beyond. Howard Briggs, the station master, brought in a second iron stove from his brother-in-law's barn and installed it in the corner, and this helped somewhat, though the help was mostly psychological. Clara wore her heavy wool coat inside during her morning shifts and told herself this was character building. She had not grown up in Kansas. Ohio winters were cold, but Ohio cold had a kind of resigned domesticity to it. Curtains, soup, the creak of settling floors. Kansas cold was something different. It was directional. It came at you. It had intentions. She mentioned this to Gideon on the last Friday of November, and he'd looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize as the precursor to a dry observation. "It gets worse," he said. "How much worse?" "January," he said, "is a different country." He was not wrong. But something else happened in that last Friday of November, something small enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been paying the particular kind of attention she'd developed over their weeks together. He'd arrived earlier than usual, 20 minutes before the train was due, which was early even for him. Clara had come out with the coffee to find him already seated, already turned toward the tracks, but with something different in the set of his shoulders. Less settled. More like a man who was working something out. She sat down. She handed him the cup. He took it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said. A few weeks back. About going through it badly." She waited. "I think I've been going through it badly for 3 years," he said. "And I think I've been telling myself that was the same thing as going through it." Clara looked at the tracks. "Is there a difference?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe the difference is knowing it's bad and doing it anyway, versus thinking if you sit still enough, it'll turn into something else." He paused. "I've been sitting still for 3 years." "You came here every week," she said. "That's not sitting still. That's showing up." "To a train platform," he said. "To watch an empty train." "To a place that matters," she said. "For someone who mattered. There's nothing wrong with that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thomas thinks I should see a doctor in Wichita. Says there are men who specialize in grief, I suppose. Mental distress." He said the last 2 words with the careful neutrality of a man who finds them slightly foreign but is trying to be fair to them. "Says it's not natural, the amount of time I've—" "Thomas can go straight to Wichita himself," Clara said. Gideon stopped. She heard herself say it and felt her face go warm. "I'm sorry," she said. That was... But Gideon Ashcroft was laughing. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. Actually laugh, not the dry, almost sound he sometimes made at his own expense. It was a real laugh, startled out of him, low and genuine, and it lasted maybe 4 seconds before he caught it and brought it back under control. But those 4 seconds changed something. The air on the platform felt different afterward, less heavy. "You're not what I expected," he said, when he'd recovered. "What did you expect?" "Martha Greer was the station clerk for 11 years, he said. "She had a way of looking at me that made me feel like a broken piece of equipment she didn't have the parts to fix." "Martha Greer," Clara said carefully, "told me on my first day that you were a waste of a seat." Gideon's expression went briefly, perfectly still. "She said that." Those were her words. He looked at the coffee cup in his hands. Then he said, with a quiet evenness that was somehow more pointed than anger, "Rosalie always said Martha Greer had the empathy of a fence post." "Rosalie," Clara said, "sounds like she was an excellent judge of character." "She was," he said, and then, softer, "She was." The train came in at 3:51. They watched it together in the easy silence that had become their habit, and when it pulled out and Gideon stood to leave, he paused in a way he hadn't before, not at the top of the steps, not moving away yet, just stopped for a moment with his hat in his hands. "The south pasture fence needs work before the real cold sets in," he said, in the tone of a man explaining something to himself as much as to her. "I'm doing it this week. Thomas thinks it's a waste of time, given everything. But if I don't fix the fence, I lose the pasture in the thaw. And if I lose the pasture..." He stopped. Anyway, Clara agreed. "I'll see you next Friday," he said. She noticed he'd never said that before. He'd always just left. "I'll have coffee," she said. He put his hat on and went down the steps. Clara sat on the bench a moment longer, listening to the sound of his horse moving away down the street, and she thought, something is shifting. She didn't know toward what. She wasn't sure she needed to yet. But something that had been very still was starting, slowly and without drama, to move. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of December. Clara almost missed it. It was tucked between a freight notification and a circular from the railway company about updated signal protocols. And it was only the return address that made her stop. Willoughby and Sons Railway, Kansas City. She didn't know anyone at Willoughby and Sons Railway in Kansas City. She opened it at the counter during the midday lull, with Howard Briggs at lunch and the waiting room empty. It was a job offer. Not just a job offer, a substantial one. Head clerk at the Kansas City Junction Station, a position that would mean twice her current pay, a proper railway pension, and the kind of professional standing that a woman in 1885 did not often get offered without spending a decade proving she deserved it. The letter was formal and precise, and clearly written by someone who had taken the trouble to inquire about her work record before writing it. She read it 3 times, then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the freight notification. And for the rest of the afternoon she was efficient and accurate and did not make a single arithmetic error. And when she locked up at 5:30 and walked home through the frozen streets of Blackstone Crossing, she told herself she was not going to think about it tonight. She thought about it all night. It wasn't a complicated decision, she told herself. It was a practical one. She was a single woman with no family left and no particular ties to this town. And she had taken this job as a stopgap, hadn't she? A temporary measure while she figured out what came next. Blackstone Crossing had never been the destination. It had been the breathing room between the life she'd had and whatever life was going to come after. The letter was what came after. This was sensible. She fell asleep around midnight and dreamed about the train platform, which was not, she told herself upon waking, meaningful. She didn't tell Gideon about the letter on the next Friday. She had almost decided not to go to Kansas City, not because of him, or not only because of him, but because it meant leaving again, and she had only just started to feel like she was somewhere she recognized. And it seemed unnecessary to complicate a pleasant afternoon with something that might not even happen. That was the version of events she presented to herself. She came out with the coffee at 3:25. The temperature was 11 degrees below what it had been last week, and she'd put on her second heaviest pair of wool socks and still felt the cold through the platform boards. The bench had a thin rime of frost on the back rail that she noted and ignored. Gideon was already there. He had, she noticed, added a heavier coat since last week, a buffalo skin one that looked ancient and smelled, at a distance, like something that had lived a full and eventful life outdoors. It suited him in the way that practical, unselfconscious things suited a man who had no patience for vanity. "Fixed the fence," he said when she sat down. "All of it?" "Most of it. Enough." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Thomas came by Wednesday. Said I was wasting time and money I didn't have." "And?" "And I told him the fence needed fixing and I was fixing it." He paused. "He's not wrong that I'm short on both, but there's a kind of wrong that comes from being right about the wrong things." Clara thought about this. "He cares about you," she said. "I know he does." Gideon's voice wasn't hard. "He's 23 and he's scared I'm going to lose everything and end up with nothing. He's not wrong to be scared, he's just—" He stopped. "Rosalie always handled him better than I did. She knew how to talk to him without it turning into something." "What does it turn into?" Clara asked. "He thinks I'm stuck," Gideon said flatly. "That's what it turns into. He thinks I'm a man who got stuck in 1882 and can't find his way back to the present." The wind came sideways off the creek, and Clara felt it find every gap in her coat simultaneously. She pressed her hands together around her own coffee cup. "Are you?" she said. She felt him look at her. "Partially," he said after a moment. "I think partially stuck is probably accurate." He looked at the tracks. "The ranch keeps me in the present. The livestock, the fences, the problem of feeding cattle through a hard winter. You can't be stuck in the past and solve a problem in front of you at the same time. So during the week, I'm in the present." He paused. "Fridays, I allow myself to be somewhere else for an hour." "That seems reasonable," Clara said. "Thomas doesn't think so." "Thomas," Clara said, "hasn't lost a spouse." She paused. "Or anything significant, from what I can tell." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He hasn't." He shifted on the bench. "He'll understand someday. I don't wish it on him, the understanding, but he'll have it eventually." The eastbound was late again, 9 minutes. And in that extra 9 minutes, something happened that hadn't happened before. Gideon asked her something. Not about the station, not about the weather or the freight schedule. He asked, "What did you want to be before the years with your parents? What did you think you were going to do with your life?" Clara was so startled by the question that she answered it honestly before she could think to deflect. "I wanted to work in a city," she said. "Not for any particular reason I could ever explain well. I always felt like I was built for somewhere larger, more moving parts, more to navigate." She looked at her coffee cup. "I used to read the schedules in the Ohio papers, train schedules, shipping routes. Not because I was going anywhere, just because I liked seeing all the places listed, all the places something could go." "What stopped you?" "Mother got sick," she said simply. "And then I couldn't leave. And then after she passed, Father needed—" He wasn't sick exactly, just diminished. He got smaller without her somehow. A lot of men do." She paused. "And then he was gone too, and by then I'd been in the house so long that the idea of a city felt like something from a story someone else had told me." Gideon was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "You're still young enough," he said. She looked at him. "For the city," he said. "Whatever you wanted that was larger. You're still young enough that it's not theoretical." Clara thought of the letter folded in her coat pocket. She thought of Willoughby and Sons Railway, Kansas City. She thought of twice her current pay and a railway pension and professional standing. "Maybe," she said. "Not maybe," he said. "That's not a maybe. You're, what, 32? 31. 31, he said. "That's not old. That's barely started." He said it with a directness she hadn't expected and something behind it that she couldn't quite name. Not urgency exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Don't let the years with your parents become a reason to stay small. That's not what they would have wanted from you." Clara looked at the tracks. The letter in her pocket felt suddenly very heavy. "You sound like you're trying to talk me into something," she said. He paused. "I'm trying to talk you into not selling yourself short," he said. "There's a difference." The train came in. They watched it together as they always did. The passengers came off. No one ran. Gideon did the thing behind his face that she'd learned to recognize, put it away, stood up. He paused at the top of the steps. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Whatever it is you're not telling me," he said, "you don't have to. But you're not as easy to read as you think you are." She stared at him. He put his hat on and went down the steps. She sat on the bench in the 11 degrees colder than last week air and thought about the way he'd said her name. The careful way he always said it, like he was being responsible with something that belonged to him to take care of. She pulled the letter out of her coat pocket. She read it again in the fading afternoon light, her breath clouding over the formal Kansas City letterhead. She folded it back up. She did not that evening write to Willoughby and Sons Railway with a response. She told herself she was still thinking. She told herself she needed more time. What she did not tell herself, because she was not yet ready to put language around it, was this: that she was afraid. Not of the city, not of the job, not of starting over in a new place. She had done harder things than that. She was afraid of what it would mean to leave a man who had just said whatever it is you're not telling me, with the particular quietness of someone who had decided, without making a production of it, that you were worth paying attention to. She was afraid of what it said about her, that she was even considering staying in a frontier town in the middle of a Kansas winter, because a widowed rancher with a struggling cattle operation and a dead wife's kitchen garden had learned how she took her coffee without being told. The following Friday, she came out to the platform and found that he had left something on the bench before she arrived. It was small, a folded piece of cloth, rough woven, the color of dried grass. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sprig of dried herb, still faintly fragrant, the kind of thing that had lived indoors through a summer before being pressed flat. There was no note. She didn't need one. She stood on the cold platform holding a sprig from a kitchen garden that came back every year without being asked to, planted by a woman she'd never met, given to her by a man who was learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, that honoring the dead and investing in the living were not mutually exclusive acts. And she thought, I haven't written back to Kansas City yet. She thought, I'm not sure I'm going to. She thought, I don't know if that's brave or foolish, and I think it might be both. And I think I'm going to sit on this cold bench and drink my coffee and wait for the man to arrive and let that be enough for today. Somewhere up the street, a door opened. The smell of wood smoke drifted down from the direction of Maine. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with weather that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. The bench was cold. Clara sat on it anyway. And she waited. She kept the dried herb sprig on the windowsill above her wash basin. She told herself this was because she had nowhere better to put it. This was not true, and she knew it was not true, but it was a comfortable enough fiction to live inside for a while. January arrived, and Gideon had not been wrong about it. January was a different country entirely. The temperature dropped to places Clara's Ohio upbringing had not prepared her for, and the wind that came off the open prairie to the west was the kind that made philosophical arguments feel pointless. You did not think about much when the wind was blowing at 15 below. You thought about the next warm thing, the stove, the blanket, the cup of something hot in your hands. She wore 3 layers to work. Howard Briggs wore 4 and still complained about his knees. The station's waiting room had become, by default, a refuge for anyone in Blackstone Crossing who needed to be somewhere warmer than outside. And Clara spent a portion of every morning gently redirecting people who had no trains to catch and no parcels to collect, but had simply arrived because the iron stoves were going and they had nowhere better to be. She did not mind this as much as Howard Briggs did. She understood the impulse. The letter from Willoughby and Sons Railway sat in the drawer of her rented room's small writing desk. She had not written back. She had not thrown it away. This was a form of decision-making she recognized as dishonest, but she kept doing it anyway, because the alternative was choosing, and choosing required being certain about things she was not certain about. What she was certain about, Fridays. She was certain about Fridays the way she was certain about the morning freight being 7 minutes late and Howard Briggs's lunch hour being inviolable. It was a fixed point. Everything else in the week organized itself in relation to it, which was a thing she noticed and did not comment on, even to herself. The January Fridays were brutal on the platform. The cold came in off the open tracks with nothing to stop it, and the bench had stopped being merely cold and had become actively hostile to sitting on for extended periods. Clara brought a folded wool blanket and put it on the wood, which helped somewhat. Gideon arrived the second Friday of January to find the blanket already there and stopped at the top of the platform steps and looked at it for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. He sat down without saying anything about it. She came out with the coffee. She'd started keeping a small pot on the stove in the back office, just for Fridays, And he took his cup and they sat together with the blanket between them and the cold pressing in from every direction. And it was, Clara thought, one of the more comfortable she had felt all week. Lost 11 more head, he said, not as an opening, just as a fact that needed to be said. How many does that leave you? Enough, barely. He drank his coffee. The disease has run through what it's going to run through, the veterinarian thinks. Says the remaining animals look clear. But I'm going into spring with about 40% of what I had in September. Clara thought about what 40% of a cattle operation meant for a man already running tight. What do you do now? She asked. I rebuild, he said. Slowly. Start with younger stock in spring, smaller investment, work back up. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man says a thing he has already made peace with, even if the peace was hard to reach. It'll take 2-3 years to get back to where I was. Maybe 4. You sound like you've decided. I decided in November, he said. When Thomas came by and made his argument about selling. He paused. That night I went out and walked the south pasture. The one with Rosalie's fence markers. She had a particular way of doing fence markers, painted them different colors by section, so you could see at a glance what part of the property you were on. He stopped for a moment. The colors have faded some, but you can still see them if you know what you're looking at. He drank his coffee. I decided I wasn't going anywhere. Clara looked at the tracks. She sounds like someone who thought in systems, she said. He considered this. Yes, he said. That's a good way to put it. She'd look at a problem and see the whole of it before she said anything. I always came at things more directly, more, head first. He glanced at her. She said it was my best quality and my worst habit simultaneously. My mother said something similar about my father, Clara said. She used the phrase magnificently impractical. Gideon made the sound that was almost a laugh. That's generous, he said. She was a generous woman, Clara said. It made her very lovable and occasionally very exhausting. They were quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that happens when two people have said something real simultaneously and both need a second to let it settle. The eastbound was on time that Friday, exactly on time, which happened rarely enough that Howard Briggs had come out of his office to watch it arrive with the look of a man witnessing a minor astronomical event. Clara and Gideon watched the passengers come off, and she noticed, as she always noticed, even when she tried not to, the moment Gideon tracked the last door, the moment the platform was empty again, the moment he put it away. He was faster at putting it away than he had been in October. She didn't know if that meant anything. She thought it might. After the train pulled out, he didn't stand up immediately. He sat with his empty coffee cup and looked at his hands for a moment. I want to ask you something, he said, and you don't have to answer. All right, she said. Are you thinking about leaving? The cold air seemed to get colder. Clara looked at the empty tracks. What makes you ask that? She said. You've been thinking about something for 6 weeks, he said. Something you're not saying. And I've been trying to decide whether it was my business to notice that. And I've decided it is because... He stopped. He picked up his empty cup and looked at it like he was surprised to find it empty. Because I notice it, he finished, simply. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the letter in the desk drawer. She thought about the dried herb sprig on her windowsill. She thought about the distance between Kansas City and Blackstone Crossing and what that distance would look like expressed in Fridays. I got a job offer, she said. In December, Kansas City, head clerk at the junction station. Gideon said nothing. It's a good offer, she said. Good pay, proper pension. The kind of position I'd have to work another 10 years to reach through normal means. She looked at her own hands. I haven't written back yet. Why not? She looked at him. I'm not sure, she said, which was not the full truth. The full truth was large and formless, and she didn't have the right language for it yet. Gideon was looking at the tracks. Kansas City is the right kind of place for someone who reads train schedules for pleasure, he said. Clara stared at him. I told you that? In November. You said you used to read scheduling newspapers in Ohio, not to go anywhere, just because you liked seeing where things could go. He paused. I remembered it. She did not know what to do with the fact that he had remembered it. She filed it next to the dried sprig and the 2-word note and the way he said her name. You think I should go, she said. I think, he said carefully, that you came to Blackstone Crossing because you needed somewhere to breathe, not because you planned to stay. And I think that if you turn down the kind of offer that comes to people like you once in a decade, you'll spend the rest of your life measuring what you have against what you gave up." He stopped. "I've done that. It's not pleasant." There was something in the way he said it that made her chest tighten. "Gideon," she said. "I'm not the reason to stay," he said, quietly, firmly, with a flatness that didn't quite match the rest of him. "Don't make me that." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She didn't say it in agreement. She said it in the way you say a word when you need more time to figure out what's actually true, and the word is a placeholder for that time. He stood, put on his hat, said goodnight. She sat on the blanket-covered bench a long time after he was gone. The February letter arrived on a Monday. It was from Willoughby and Sons Railway, and it was shorter than the first, a follow-up, politely noting that the position was still available, but that they would require a decision by the 1st of March. The tone was still professional, still respectful, but there was a new quality to it, finality. This was the last time they intended to ask. Clara read it at the counter during the morning lull, and then put it under the freight ledger and didn't look at it again until closing. She walked home in the dark. It was still getting dark early, February dark, the kind that landed at 5 o'clock and stayed, and she thought about what Gideon had said. "I'm not the reason to stay. Don't make me that." She thought about what it said about him that he had said it. A lesser man, a lonelier man, might have said nothing and waited to see what she chose. A weaker man might have said something calculated, not a lie exactly, but something shaped to influence without being accountable for influencing. Gideon had said, "I'm not the reason to stay." He had said it because he meant it, and he had meant it because he thought it was the right thing for her, and he had thought it was the right thing for her because, and this was the part that kept stopping her in the middle of thoughts and sidewalks, because he had started to think about what was right for her. Not abstractly, specifically. He had remembered train schedules. She got home and made tea and stood at the window and looked out at the frozen street and thought about Kansas City. The junction station would be large, busy, complicated. It would have 12 incoming lines and twice the freight volume of Blackstone Crossing, and she would be responsible for a staff of 4 and a budget that would make Howard Briggs's eyes water. It would be everything she had once thought she was built for. She thought about what built for meant, whether being built for something was the same as needing it. She went to bed without deciding anything, and she woke up at 2 in the morning with the thought fully formed in a way that sleep sometimes delivered things. She had not once, thought about the Kansas City position on a Friday afternoon. Not once, in 6 weeks, had she sat on that bench and thought about Kansas City. She had thought about it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday. But not Friday. Friday, her mind was entirely in Blackstone Crossing, on a bench, with a coffee cup in her hands, watching a man watch a train. She lay in the dark and thought about what that meant. In the first week of February, Ed Harlow came back to the station. He came on a Wednesday again, which Clara had come to understand was his pattern. Wednesdays when he had something to say that he didn't want witnessed by the Friday afternoon platform crowd. He leaned on the counter with the same proprietary ease, and he smiled the same multi-purpose smile, and Clara looked up from her ledger with the expression she'd been practicing, the one that said she was listening but had strong reservations about what she was about to hear. "Word is you got an offer from the Kansas City Junction," he said. Clara went still. "Where did you hear that?" "Small town," Ed Harlow said pleasantly. She thought, Howard Briggs. Howard Briggs had seen the letterhead when she'd been careless about leaving the first letter on the counter. Howard Briggs had not meant any harm by it. Howard Briggs told his wife things. His wife told Ruth Kavanaugh things. Ruth Kavanaugh told apparently everyone. "That's my private correspondence," she said. "Sure it is," Ed Harlow said. "Just Blackstone Crossing's a good town, but it's a small one. Not much room to grow here for someone with ambition." He paused. "Unlike some people who are content to sit still for years." Clara put down her pen. "Mr. Harlow," she said, "I think you should know that I find your continued interest in Gideon Ashcroft's personal circumstances and my personal decisions to be remarkable in its persistence and baffling in its purpose. You've now made 2 trips to this station to say things to me that were neither asked for nor useful. I'd like this to be the last one." Ed Harlow blinked. He had not expected that. "I'm just being neighborly," he said, but it came out less certain this time. "You're trying to make sure I leave," she said, "and I'd like you to stop. Because whether I stay or go is going to be based on my own assessment of my life, not on your investment in Gideon Ashcroft's South Pasture. She picked her pen back up. Were you needing a ticket? Ed Harlow straightened his coat. He gave her a look that was trying to be dismissive and landed somewhere closer to rattled. You're a sharp one, he said. Yes, said Clara. I am. He left. She put the pen down again because her hand had developed a slight tremble, which she recognized as the physical aftermath of having said something brave. She had learned this about herself over the years, that courage, for her, had a 2-second delay and then arrived all at once, and then afterward left her slightly shaky, like an engine that had run hard. She sat with the trembling hand for a minute. Then she picked the pen back up and went back to the ledger. That Friday she arrived on the platform to find Gideon already seated, which was not unusual, and Thomas Ashcroft standing 10 feet away with his hat in his hands, which was. Thomas turned when he heard her come through the door. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him, somehow. Not in years, but in the particular way that worry ages a face. He nodded at her with something that looked like it wanted to be an apology and wasn't quite managing it. Miss Winslow, he said. Thomas? She said. She looked at Gideon. He looked back at her with the flat gray steadiness that she had stopped reading as emptiness and started reading as a kind of controlled patience, the patience of a man who was in the middle of a conversation he was tired of but was going to see through. She set the 2 coffee cups down on the bench. She'd brought one for herself, as she had for the past several weeks, and turned to Thomas. Would you like one? She asked. There's more on the stove. Thomas looked briefly surprised. No, thank you, ma'am. All right. She sat down. Thomas looked at his uncle. I went to see Harlow, he said, and he said it like a confession. The quality of Gideon's silence changed. When? Gideon said. 2 weeks ago. Thomas turned his hat in his hands. I went to talk to him about the offer, the South Pasture. I thought if I knew what he was willing to pay. You had no business doing that, Gideon said. His voice was even. That was what made it hard. It was perfectly, carefully even. I know, Thomas said. You went behind me. I know. To a man who has been trying to pick my land apart for 4 years. I know. Thomas's voice cracked slightly on the last one. He was 23 and he was frightened and he had done something he'd known was wrong and then had to come and say it out loud, which Clara thought took some courage, even if the original act hadn't. I don't want to watch you lose everything. I watched Aunt Rosalie. He stopped, swallowed. I was there when she died, Uncle Gideon. I was there in Lawrence with Aunt Mary when it happened. You weren't, and I was, and I can't watch you run this place into the ground, too. The silence after that was the kind Clara felt she should not be present for. But she was present for it, and she didn't move because moving felt like it would make it worse. Gideon was looking at his nephew. Something was happening behind his face that was more complex than anything she'd seen there before. Grief, and something that might have been guilt, and something that might have been understanding, all moving at the same time, none of them winning. Thomas, he said finally. Sir? You should have told me you were there, he said. When it happened, that you were in that house. Thomas's jaw worked. I didn't want to. I didn't think it would help. It would have helped, Gideon said. It would have helped considerably. They looked at each other across 10 feet of cold platform, 2 people who had been carrying the same loss from different angles and had never quite compared notes on what it weighed. Clara looked at the tracks and gave them what privacy she could while remaining where she was. After a moment, she heard Thomas say quietly, I won't go to Harlow again. And Gideon, I know. I'm not going to stop worrying about the ranch. I know that too. But I'll stop pushing. A long pause. Coming out Sunday, Gideon said. Help me look at the east fence line. It could use another set of eyes. Thomas put his hat back on. He nodded once, at Gideon and then at Clara. His eyes were bright in a way that he was clearly hoping wasn't visible. He went down the platform steps. Clara and Gideon sat in the silence for a moment. I didn't know he was in Lawrence, Gideon said, not to her specifically, just to the air. When Rosalie passed, I knew he'd visited, but I didn't know he was there that day. No, Clara said. 3 years, he said. We've both been carrying that for 3 years without... He stopped, shook his head once. That's a lot of wasted time. Clara thought about her own wasted times. The months after her mother's death, when she and her father had been living in the same house and grief talking at each other instead of to each other, both of them narrating their own pain into separate rooms, never quite finding the overlap. People do that, she said. They carry things separately when they could carry them together. I think it's because admitting you're struggling to someone who's struggling feels like adding weight instead of sharing it. That's exactly what it feels like, he said. But it's wrong, she said, about how weight works. He looked at her back and she held the look longer than she usually did, long enough that something passed between them that didn't have a name yet, but was clearly something, was clearly more than coffee and bench and shared Fridays, was clearly a thing that both of them were aware of, and neither of them was ready to call by its right name. The train came in, braking it. They watched it together. Passengers, luggage, noise, steam, the whole ordinary business of a world going somewhere. When it pulled out, Gideon stayed seated a moment longer than usual. Have you written back to Kansas City? He said. Not yet, she said. When do you need to decide? 1st of March. He nodded. He turned the empty coffee cup in his hands. That's 3 Fridays, he said. Yes, she said. 3 Fridays. He stood. He put his hat on. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had stopped finding plain and started finding entirely specific to him. Nobody else's gray, just his. Whatever you decide, he said, it should be what you want, not what you think you should want, not what's sensible. He paused. I spent 3 years doing the sensible thing and sitting still and not wanting anything because wanting something felt disloyal. Sensible isn't always right. He went down the steps. She sat with the empty cups and the wool blanket in the cold, and she thought, 3 Fridays. She thought, wanting something felt disloyal. She thought about what it would take for a man who had protected himself with stillness for 3 years to say something like that to a woman on a train platform in February. The following Friday, something happened that had never happened before. He brought her something, not left it on the bench before she arrived, the way she left his coffee. He had it with him when he came onto the platform, held in one large, slightly awkward hand, and he held it out to her when she sat down with a straightforwardness that did not entirely conceal the fact that this had required a decision. It was a jar, small, dark glass, sealed with wax. She took it and looked at it. There was no label. From the kitchen garden, he said. Rosalie put up herb preserves every fall. The jars from her last year are still in the cellar. I don't use them. I don't know how to use them properly. She always just knew what went with what. He paused. But it seemed like the kind of thing that should be used, not just kept. Clara held the small jar and felt the weight of it. Not just the physical weight, which was slight, but the other weight. The weight of what it had taken for him to go into his cellar and pick up something his wife had made with her hands and carry it across town to give to someone else. Thank you, she said. It was inadequate. She said it anyway. She would have liked you, he said. Rosalie. He said it looking at the tracks, not at her. She liked people who said true things without making a performance of it. Clara's throat did something she hadn't prepared for. I would have liked her, she said, when she could trust her voice. I know, he said. That's why I said it. The train that Friday was late by 11 minutes, which was on the longer end of its usual range, and in those 11 minutes they talked about things that had nothing to do with grief or Kansas City or ranch finances. He told her about a coyote that had been circling the north pasture at night and his increasingly complicated efforts to discourage it without harming it, because, he said, with the flat practicality of a man who finds this slightly embarrassing, Rosalie had had opinions about coyotes that he'd somehow inherited. Clara told him about her father's obsession with a particular type of Ohio apple that he'd spent 15 years trying to get to grow right in his garden and never quite managing, and how she'd found, when clearing the house after his death, 3 pages of notes in his handwriting about soil acidity and root depth that he'd been adding to for a decade. Did you keep them? Gideon asked. Yes, she said. I don't know why. I can't grow apples. I live in a rented room. You kept them because they were his, he said. Yes, she said, because they were his. They looked at each other, and the look was the same as the one that had happened before the train arrived the previous week, the wordless, nameless thing, except it lasted longer this time, 3 or 4 full seconds, long enough to be unambiguous, long enough for both of them to know that the other one had held it. Then the train whistle sounded from around the eastern curve, and they both looked away, and Clara thought, 2 Fridays. She thought, this is the thing I have been not saying for 3 months. She thought, I know what I want. I've known for a while. I've been waiting to be sure I wasn't just afraid of Kansas City, that I wasn't just choosing the familiar thing, that this was a real want and not just an absence of courage. She thought, I'm sure now. She thought, I'm not going to say it yet. Not because she was afraid, but because some things needed to ripen in their own time. And she had learned, slowly, from years of caring for people who were leaving, that the worst thing you could do to something fragile and new was handle it before it was ready. The train came in. The passengers came off. No one ran. And when the platform was empty again, Clara watched Gideon watch the curve in the tracks, and she watched him put it away. And she thought that the putting away was faster now than it had been in October. She thought that the weight of it was still there, but had changed quality, the way grief changed when it started becoming memory instead of wound. She thought, he is doing it. Slowly and badly and without a plan, but he is doing it. She thought, so am I. He stood and put on his hat. 2 Fridays, he said, which startled her. She hadn't said it aloud. What? She said. He looked at her. You said 3 Fridays 2 weeks ago, that you had 3 Fridays to decide. He paused. That means you've got 2 left. She looked at him. Yes, she said. 2 left. He held her gaze for a moment. Not the long, loaded look from before. Something shorter and more deliberate, like a man confirming something he already suspected. All right, he said. He went down the steps. She sat on the bench with the wool blanket and the small dark jar in her coat pocket, and the knowledge, settled now and final, and not frightening in the way she'd expected it to be, of what she was going to do. She was going to write to Willoughby & Sons Railway in Kansas City. She was going to thank them for their interest. She was going to tell them no. Not because she was afraid of the city, not because she was settling for less, not because some quiet widowed rancher had learned how she took her coffee. She was going to tell them no because she had been sitting on this bench for 3 months, learning how to want something real, and real things happened in the present tense. And she was in Blackstone Crossing, and the present tense was here. She would write the letter tonight. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the small, cool curve of the glass jar. 1 Friday left. She wrote the letter that same night. She sat at the small writing desk in her rented room with the lamp turned up as high as it would go and the wind pressing against the window glass in long, low pulses, and she wrote 2 drafts before she got it right. The first draft was too apologetic, full of qualifications and explanations, as though she owed Willoughby & Sons Railway a detailed accounting of her interior life. The second draft was better, professional, clear. She thanked them for the offer, acknowledged its quality without false modesty, and declined. She sealed it before she could change her mind. She mailed it Tuesday morning on her way to work, pushing it through the post office slot with the particular decisiveness of someone who knows that if they hold on to it 1 more second, they will open it and start again. The letter made its small sound going in. She took her hand back. She stood in the cold post office entryway for a moment, breathing. There. Done. She walked to work in the dark of a February morning with the strange lightness of a person who has stopped carrying a question. She had expected, after, to feel doubt. She had expected the second-guessing to arrive promptly, the way it usually did when she made large decisions, the immediate re-examination, the inventory of everything she might have given up. Instead, what she felt was closer to relief, which told her something about the quality of the decision that she tucked away carefully. She did not tell Gideon. Not because she was hiding it, because there was only 1 Friday left before the deadline, and she found that she wanted to tell him on the platform, in the place where most of the true things between them had happened, with the tracks in front of them, and the winter light going flat, and the eastbound still 20 minutes from arriving. She wanted to tell him there because that was where they were honest with each other, and this felt like the most honest thing she'd had to say. She waited. The last Friday of February arrived with a temperature that had climbed, fractionally but perceptibly, out of the depths of January cold into something that was merely unpleasant rather than punishing. There was a quality to the light that morning that Clara recognized from Ohio, a particular pale gold, thin and without warmth, but directional in a way that January light wasn't. Light with intentions, she thought, light that was going somewhere. She made the coffee at 3:15. She brought the wool blanket, which had become as automatic as the cups by now, and she was through the platform door at 3:20 to find that for the first time in months, the bench was empty. She stopped. She looked up and down the platform. No one. She sat down and put the cups on the bench and waited. 3:30. The bench beside her still empty. She told herself it was nothing. He'd been delayed. The roads in February were unreliable. His horse might have thrown a shoe. Any number of ordinary things could hold a man up on a Friday afternoon. She told herself this while the cold worked its way through the wool blanket and the coffee in the cups went from hot to warm. 3:45. The eastbound was due in 10 minutes. She was standing, had half risen from the bench with some idea of going to find Howard Briggs and asking if there'd been any messages when she heard boots on the platform steps. She turned. Gideon came up the steps at a pace that was not quite running but was several degrees faster than his usual unhurried approach. And he was not wearing his buffalo skin coat, just his regular wool one, and his hat was pulled down against wind he'd been riding into, and he had the look of a man who had been dealing with something difficult and had not quite finished dealing with it before being required to be somewhere else. He stopped when he saw her standing. "I'm late," he said. "I noticed," she said. He came across the platform and sat down and took the coffee cup without preamble. She sat back down. "What happened?" she said. He drank the coffee, half of it, in one go, the way a man does when he's cold and has been working and needs something to land on. Then he set the cup on the bench arm and looked at the tracks. "Harlow happened," he said. Clara went still. "He filed a complaint with the county land office," Gideon said. "Claims there's a surveying error on the south boundary of my property. Says the fence line is 15 feet into his land." He said it with the flat, controlled evenness of a man who has been furious for several hours and has burned through the hot part of it. "It's not. I have the original survey from 1869. But it means I have to appear before the county assessor in Wichita in 3 weeks and prove it." "Can you prove it?" she said. "Yes. It'll cost me 2 days and travel money I'd rather spend on spring stock, but yes." He paused. "What I can't figure out is why now. He's known that boundary for 15 years. He's never disputed it before." Clara thought about Ed Harlow leaning on her counter with his multi-purpose smile. "He came to see me again," she said. "A few weeks ago. He knows about the Kansas City offer." Gideon turned his head and looked at her. "How does he know about that?" "Small town," she said, using his phrase from months ago. "I think he believes if I leave, it changes things. For you." She paused. "He's pushing from every angle he has, Gideon. The boundary complaint isn't about the land. It's about costing you time and money right before spring." Gideon was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. Not the anger. He'd already worked through most of that. But the calculation. What it meant. What it cost. What he was going to do. 2 days in Wichita," he said again. "Thomas will need to cover the feeding while I'm gone." "Will Thomas do it?" "Thomas will do it and lecture me the entire time about the wisdom of selling the south pasture and eliminating the boundary dispute permanently." He said it without rancor. "He's not entirely wrong about the logic." "But you're still not going to sell." He looked at her with something that was almost impatience. "No." "I know," she said. "I wasn't asking, I was confirming." The ghost of the almost smile. "Confirming what?" "That you're still the man I've been drinking coffee with for 4 months," she said. "The one who fixes fences that might not make it to summer and saves herb preserves someone else made and shows up every Friday to a place that costs him something every single time." She looked at him directly. "Yes, I was confirming that." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Clara," he said. "I declined the Kansas City offer," she said. "I mailed the letter Tuesday." The silence that followed was different from all their other silences. It had a density to it, a suspended quality, like the air between lightning and the sound that follows. Gideon looked at her. She looked back. "Why?" he said. "Because I want to be here," she said. "Not because I'm afraid of Kansas City, not because I couldn't do the job, because when I tried to picture myself there, at that desk, in that city, I kept finding myself on this bench instead." She paused. "And I've lived long enough with settling for the second thing that I know the difference between choosing something and simply not leaving it." "This is the second thing?" he said, and there was something careful in how he said it. "No," she said. Blackstone Crossing was supposed to be the second thing, the breathing room, the waiting place. She looked at the tracks. It stopped being the waiting place sometime around October. He didn't say anything for a moment. She could feel him beside her. Not touching, there was still 18 inches of cold winter bench between them, but present in the specific way he'd become present to her. The way she knew the particular sound his coat made when he shifted his weight and the slight pause he took before he said something he'd actually thought about. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "I mean, I haven't—" He stopped, started again. 3 years. I've been managing, but managing isn't the same as another stop. I don't want to offer you something that isn't built right yet, something I've only half finished. Gideon, she said, I watched my father fall apart after my mother died and put himself back together piece by piece over 2 years. I know what half-finished looks like. I'm not frightened of it. She paused. I'm not asking you to be finished. He looked at her. What are you asking? He said. Nothing right now, she said. I'm telling you I stayed. What comes after that doesn't have to be decided on a February train platform. He was quiet for a moment. Rosalie would say I'm being overcomplicated, he said. Rosalie, Clara said, sounds like she would say a lot of useful things. She'd say... He stopped. Something moved through his face, brief and undefended. She'd say stop making a fence post out of a simple gate. Clara thought about this. That's a good expression. She had a lot of them. He was quiet for a moment. I miss them. I miss knowing what she'd say about things. He paused. I've started to notice that I don't always know anymore. What she'd say. Say the first year I could hear her clearly, the second year sometimes. Now, he stopped. It's getting harder to remember the exact sound of her. Clara looked at her hands. That's not forgetting her, she said carefully. That's just time doing what time does. You're still here. She's still here, in every way she can be. In the fence markers and the kitchen garden and the jar in my coat pocket. She paused. But you're still alive, Gideon. That's not a betrayal of her, it's just the truth. He didn't say anything for a long time. The eastbound came in at 4:03, which was 14 minutes late, and nobody's fault in particular. They watched it together, as they had every Friday since October. The steam, the noise, the organized chaos of arrival, the passengers who poured off and moved with the directed energy of people who had somewhere specific to be. The family with too much luggage had been replaced by different families with different too much luggage. The world kept moving through the station while they sat still beside it. When the last passenger came off, Clara watched Gideon with the attention she'd developed over months. That particular private attention, not intrusive, just present. And she watched him track the door, and she watched what passed through him, and she watched him put it away. He did it faster than she'd ever seen him do it. Not without cost. Not easily. But with a kind of deliberateness that was new, like a man who had decided to do something and was doing it. He turned and looked at her after. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, because what had just happened didn't need language. She had witnessed it. He had let her witness it. That was its own kind of thing. He stood. He put his hat on. He looked down at her. Come see the ranch, he said. Sunday. Come see it while the winter's still on it, before spring changes everything. I want... He paused, seemed to be selecting words with care. I want you to see it as it is, not as I'd want you to see it. Clara looked up at him. All right, she said. I'll come by the station at 10 o'clock, he said. If that works? That works, she said. He nodded. He put his hand on the bench rail, just briefly, just for a moment. Not her hand, the rail, 6 inches from where her hand was resting. And then he took it away and went down the steps. She sat on the platform until the cold became too much even for the wool blanket, which took longer than it should have. Sunday morning was gray and still, the kind of stillness that meant the weather was holding its breath. Clara wore her good coat and her practical boots and told herself this did not constitute getting dressed up, because it didn't, because the good coat was simply warmer than her other coat, and the practical boots were simply the most sensible footwear for unpaved roads in late February. She was ready at 9:30, which she recognized as telling. Gideon arrived at the station at 10 o'clock exactly on a sorrel horse that looked solid and old and unbothered by the cold, leading a second animal, a bay mare, smaller, with a white blaze and an expression that suggested she'd been in a mild disagreement with someone recently. "She's fine," Gideon said when Clara looked at the expression. "She just has opinions about Sundays." "I respect that," Clara said, and accepted his hand up into the saddle with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had ridden enough to know how, but not enough to be graceful about it. They rode east out of town in the particular silence of early Sunday morning, when even Blackstone Crossing's modest activity had not yet gotten started. The road was hard and rutted, the frozen mud of February that had locked every wagon track into permanent record. The horses moved steadily. Clara's mare voiced one objection to a fence post, and then settled into a resigned professionalism. "The south pasture is the first thing you'll see," Gideon said. "Then the house, and behind the house, the kitchen garden. It's not much to look at in February." "Stop apologizing for it," Clara said. He glanced at her. "You said you wanted me to see it as it is," she said. "That means stop explaining it before I see it." A pause. "Fair enough," he said. The ranch came into view around a bend in the creek road. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way most things revealed themselves in flat country, emerging incrementally from the horizon. First the fence line, long and straight, and Clara looked for the painted markers Gideon had described and found them. Weathered, faded, but visible, a different color every 100 yards or so. Blue, then red, then a yellow that had gone the color of old butter, then the outbuildings, low and practical, built for function rather than appearance, then the barn, larger than she'd expected, then the house. It was not a beautiful house, it was a good house, well constructed, added to in pieces over the years in ways that showed different eras of decision-making. The original structure was solid and square. The additions were practical but not quite matched. There was a porch along the south face that looked like it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing, and a chimney that was drawing steadily, the smoke going straight up in the still air. She thought, this is a house that was built by people who were paying attention to what they needed, not to how it looked. She thought, I like it. They dismounted at the paddock fence, and Gideon took both horses inside with the efficiency of a man for whom this was as automatic as breathing, and Clara stood at the paddock rail and looked at the house and the outbuildings and the long flat reach of the south pasture stretching toward the gray winter sky. The kitchen garden was behind the house, and it was, even in February, even dormant and bare, clearly someone's serious work. The beds were defined by low stone borders, hand-laid, not rushed. They were arranged in a specific way that she couldn't name but could feel the logic of. Something about the sightlines, the way light would hit different sections at different times of day. In the corner that Gideon had mentioned, the herbs were cut back to the ground, and she wouldn't have known what was there if she hadn't already known. But she knew. She stood at the edge of the garden and thought about the jar in her coat pocket, carried out of habit, about the woman who had laid these stones and arranged these beds and put up preserves every fall with the calm assumption that there would be another fall after this one. She did all of it herself, Gideon said, coming to stand beside her. The stone borders, the layout. I helped dig where the digging needed a second pair of arms, but the thinking was hers. She knew what she was doing, Clara said. She read everything she could get her hands on, he said. Seed catalogs, agricultural journals, letters from her sister's neighbor in Lawrence who had a serious kitchen garden. She had opinions about soil and companion planting and what to put where. He looked at the dormant beds. I've kept it weeded since she passed. I don't know what I'm doing, mostly, but I kept it weeded. The herbs still come back, Clara said. Every year, he said. She looked at the corner with the dormant herb stubs, the cut-back remnants of something that had been tended with care and had kept coming back anyway, and she thought about what it meant that this man, who had lost his wife and his certainty and almost his cattle operation, had spent 3 years making sure the weeds didn't take the garden she'd planted. Will you show me the house? She said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not quite hesitation, more like a man bracing for something he'd decided to go through with. Yes, he said. The front door opened into a main room that was exactly what she'd expected and not at all what she'd prepared for. It was clean, genuinely clean, not just surface tidied but actually maintained, which surprised her. The furniture was good quality, worn with use. There was a braided rug on the floor with a pattern she recognized as the kind of thing made over a long winter by someone with the patience to see it through. The curtains were faded but not ragged, still hung straight, and everywhere, in ways that were not dramatic or arranged for effect, was Rosalie. Not her presence exactly. Her choices. The way the furniture was positioned, angled slightly toward the window in a way that was unusual but made sense once you understood it caught the afternoon light. The row of books on the shelf beside the fireplace, ordered in a way Clara couldn't quite work out, but which was clearly a system. A sampler on the wall above the hearth, worked in red thread, that said only, "This is enough, just that, nothing more." Clara stood in front of it for a moment. "She made that the second winter we were here," Gideon said behind her. "We'd had a hard year. Cattle prices were down. We'd lost the east fence in a flood. We were talking about whether we'd made a mistake coming here, whether we should go back to Ohio." He paused. "She woke up one morning and said she'd decided, and she spent 3 weeks on that sampler, and she hung it there, and we never had the conversation again." Clara looked at the words. "This is enough." "She was right," Clara said. "She usually was," he said. The kitchen was in the back of the house, and it was, Clara thought, the most alive room she'd been in a long time. The stove was a good one, the serious, practical kind that people bought when they intended to cook on it for 30 years. The shelves had a specific organization to them, things grouped by purpose, in a way that was so clear and sensible it would have been easy to maintain even without knowing the original system. And on the lowest shelf, in the corner near the window, were the remaining herb preserves. 8 jars. Dark glass. Same wax seals as the one in Clara's pocket. She looked at them for a moment without speaking. "I told you I wasn't using them right," Gideon said. He was in the kitchen doorway, not quite entering the room. "I'd get to the end of the week and I'd think, I should use one. And then I couldn't, and then another week would go by." "You gave me one," she said. "That was different," he said. "How?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because giving it to you felt like using it for what she'd have wanted it for." He stopped. "She would have given them away. She was always giving things away. I'm not as good at that." Clara turned and looked at him in the kitchen doorway. "You've been giving things away all winter," she said. "You just haven't been calling it that." He looked at her with the gray eyes, and the careful slowness, and the things she'd spent months learning to read. "I haven't been entirely honest," he said, "about why I told you not to make me the reason to stay." She waited. "It wasn't entirely—" He stopped, tried again. "I meant it, what I said. You should make your decisions for your own reasons, not because of me. That's true." He paused. "But I also said it because I was afraid. That I was going to say something, and it wasn't going to come out right, and you'd be gone before I'd figured out how to say it properly." "Gideon," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. I've been practicing this." She pressed her lips together and waited. "I've spent 3 years coming to that platform," he said, "and for the first 2.5 years, I knew exactly what I was doing and why. And then sometime in October, a woman I'd never met came out in the rain with a cup of coffee and asked me a question that nobody else had thought to ask, and He stopped. "I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, entirely. But I know that Fridays are different now, and the rest of the week is different, and the difference is you. And I know that when you told me about the Kansas City offer, the thing I felt—" He paused. "The thing I felt was not what a man feels when a friend or a neighbor might be leaving. And I think you probably already knew that. But I wanted to say it anyway." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the paddock, one of the horses made a sound and then was quiet again. Clara thought about October. About a rainy afternoon and a question she'd asked without planning to. About coffee getting cold on a platform bench, and a 2-word note, and a dried herb sprig, and a small dark jar, and all the accumulated Fridays since, each one adding something to a thing she hadn't had language for until recently. "I knew," she said. "I also knew what I felt. I just wasn't sure if the timing was—" "It's bad timing," he said, "by almost any measure. My operation is short 40% of its cattle. I have an expensive surveying dispute in 3 weeks. My nephew thinks I'm a man who got stuck in 1882. He paused. "But I've also decided that waiting for good timing is something you do when you have the kind of time to spare that I've learned I don't have." She looked at him. He was standing in his kitchen doorway with his hands at his sides and his hat on the table behind her. He'd taken it off when they came inside without being asked. And he looked like exactly what he was. A man in his mid-50s who had been very sad for a long time and was trying, with some difficulty and no guarantee of success, to be less sad. Who was offering something half-built and unfinished because he'd decided that waiting to be done was going to mean waiting forever. She crossed the kitchen. She wasn't certain what she was going to do when she got there, but she stopped when she was close enough to see the specific gray of his eyes, and she said, "Bad timing is what we've always had. We had bad timing in October when I asked you something I had no business asking. We had bad timing in November when you were in the middle of losing cattle. We had bad timing every single Friday in the worst winter I've ever experienced." She paused. "I think bad timing might be our timing." He looked at her for a long moment, then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not like something from a romance novel. He just reached out and took her hand the way you take hold of something you've decided you're not going to keep leaving on the bench. She let him. They stood in Rosalie Ashcroft's kitchen, surrounded by her organizational systems and her remaining 8 jars of herb preserves, and the wind outside had picked up slightly, pressing against the window over the stove, and neither of them said anything for a while. "I don't know how to do this," he said again, the same thing he'd said on the platform, but it sounded different in here. "We've been doing it since October," she said. "We're just going to keep doing it and see what it becomes." He looked at her hand in his. He turned it over once, the way he turned his coffee cup when he was thinking. "I kept telling myself you'd leave," he said, "even after you said you'd declined the offer. I kept thinking, she'll find another reason, a better reason, and I'd come to terms with that." He paused. "I'd come to terms with it and still come to the platform every Friday because—" He stopped. "Because that's the thing I know how to do." "I know," she said. "I know that about you." "Is it—" He paused. "Is that all right? That I'd still come, even if—" "Yes," she said. "Gideon, it's all right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the dry flatness that was his form of humor, "Rosalie would say I am extraordinarily slow at simple things." "Most important things are simple," Clara said. "They're just not easy." He looked at her. The almost smile appeared, but this time it finished. It became a real smile, brief and unguarded, and it changed his whole face in the way she'd suspected it would from the first time she'd seen the almost version of it. She thought, there it is. She thought, I am very glad I mailed that letter on Tuesday. Outside, the light had changed. The flat gray of the morning had broken open somewhere while they weren't watching, and now there was actual sun coming through the kitchen window, pale, still winter-thin, but directional and real. Clara looked at it on the floor of Rosalie Ashcroft's kitchen. She thought about light with intentions. She thought, spring is not here yet, it is not close. There are still weeks of cold and frozen road and uncertain weather between now and anything that could be called warmth. She thought, that's all right. She was good at waiting when the thing she was waiting for was real. The weeks between February and spring were not easy, and Clara did not pretend they were. She had made her decision. She had mailed her letter. She had stood in a kitchen in late February and let a man take her hand and said the truest thing she knew how to say. None of that resolved the practical difficulty of what came after, which was the ordinary, unglamorous work of two people who had been alone for a long time trying to figure out how to not be. The Wichita trip happened in the second week of March. Gideon rode out on a Tuesday with the original survey documents from 1869 rolled in a leather case and a 2 days' worth of provisions, and the flat, resigned expression of a man doing a necessary thing he resents being necessary. Thomas came to cover the feeding as promised, and did it without lecturing, which Clara thought showed growth. She knew about the trip because Gideon told her the Friday before, not asking for anything, just telling her, the way people tell someone things when that someone has become part of the accounting of their days. She thought about him the whole 2 days he was gone in a way she didn't try to rationalize. He came back Thursday evening with the surveying dispute settled in his favor and a pulled muscle in his left shoulder from 2 days on horseback in March cold, an expression that was several degrees less flat than when he'd left. The county assessor had reviewed the original documents, compared them against Harlow's claim, and found the claim without merit. The boundary stood exactly where it always had. Ed Harlow had been informed. Clara heard all of this on Friday, on the bench, with the coffee getting cold between them because neither of them was drinking it. He's not going to stop, she said. when Gideon had finished. No, Gideon said. Probably not. But he's also out the filing fee and 2 days of his own time, and the next time he tries something with the county office, they're going to remember his name. He paused. There are better ways to spend your energy than fighting a man who's decided to make losing into a full-time occupation. Clara thought about Ed Harlow and his proprietary lean on her counter, and his careful, poisonous neighborliness. She thought about the particular kind of person who measured their own standing by the diminishment of others, who could only feel like they were gaining if someone else was losing. I told him off, she said, a few weeks ago, when he came in the second time. Gideon looked at her. I was direct about his interest in your south pasture, she said, and about his interest in whether I left. A pause. How direct? Fairly direct, she said. I may have asked him to stop coming to the station. Gideon looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Good, he said. You're not going to tell me it wasn't my business? It was entirely your business, he said. He made it your business when he walked into your station twice to say things designed to manipulate your decisions. He paused. You're allowed to defend your own space, Clara. You don't need my permission for that. She looked at the tracks. There was something in the way he'd said it, the simple, level certainty of it, that she felt settle in her chest like something coming to rest after a long time in motion. Not because she'd needed his permission, but because she'd lived long enough with people who treated her practical competence as a thing to be managed rather than respected, and the straightforwardness with which he said you're allowed was different from that. It was the way you spoke to a person you considered capable. She appreciated it more than she could easily say. The eastbound came in at 3:56, and they watched it together in the March cold that was still genuinely cold, but no longer had the vindictive edge of January. When the last passenger came off and the platform was empty, Clara watched Gideon go through the moment and come out the other side, and she thought, he is doing this differently than he was in October. Not without pain, but with something like agency, like a man who has decided that the grief is his to carry, but not his to be buried under. After the train pulled out, he reached into his coat pocket and produced something she hadn't expected, a folded paper covered in handwriting. He held it for a moment, looking at it. Thomas brought this out when he came to cover the feeding, he said. He found it in Rosalie's writing desk. He was looking for the property insurance documents, and he found this. He paused. He almost didn't give it to me. He said he wasn't sure it would help. What is it? Clara said. A letter, Gideon said. She wrote it 2 years before she died. Thomas thinks she was going to give it to me for our 20th anniversary, but she never gave it. He looked at the folded paper. Thomas read enough to know what it was and then stopped. He said it wasn't his to read. Clara said nothing. I read it in Wichita, he said, in the hotel room, both nights. He was quiet for a moment. She said she knew I would have a hard time if she went before me. She said I was the kind of man who confused loyalty with stillness, and that she wanted me to know that she never confused those things, that moving forward wasn't moving away. He stopped. His jaw worked once. She said if I met someone, I should stop being a fool about it. Clara looked at the tracks. She used that word? She said, after a moment. Fool? She used that word, he said, and the almost smile appeared, cracked and genuine and slightly broken at the edges. She also said I had a tendency to make simple things into construction projects. A sound came out of Clara that surprised her. Not quite a laugh, but something in that direction, startled out of her before she could think about it. She was right, Clara said. She was usually right, he said. He folded the letter and put it back in his coat pocket, carefully, the way he'd always handled the 5-cent platform ticket. I wanted to tell you that, about the letter, because I want to be honest with you about where I am. I know I said I was half finished. I think that's still true, but He paused. That letter helped. More than I expected a piece of paper to help. I'm glad Thomas found it, Clara said. So am I, he said, even if his timing was Thomas-shaped. She looked at him. That's a new expression, she said. I've been developing it, he said. The March wind came off the tracks with a little less malice than it had been showing all winter, and Clara sat on the bench beside him and thought, this is what it looks like. Not the beginning of something easy, not the arrival of something uncomplicated, Just two people in their 50s sitting on a cold bench with dead wives and dead parents and failed cattle operations and job offers declined and surveying disputes resolved behind them, and all of whatever came next in front of them, and neither of them pretending it was simpler than it was. She thought that was probably the only honest way to begin. Spring in Kansas came late and committed all at once, the way Kansas did things. There was no gradual warming, no gentle transition. There was cold. And then 1 week in April, the cold broke and the ground softened and the cottonwoods along the creek road put out leaves almost overnight, and the whole landscape went from the gray-brown of winter dormancy to something that looked, after months of flat light, almost aggressive in its greenness. The kitchen garden at Ashcroft Flats woke up in the third week of April. Clara was there to see it. She had been coming out to the ranch on Sundays since February. Not every Sunday, not with any formal arrangement, just with the understanding that had developed between them that Sunday mornings were a kind of continuation of Friday afternoons, conducted over coffee on the porch instead of on the platform bench. Gideon had fixed the porch step that had been loose since the fall, which she had not commented on, because some things were allowed to be done quietly. She had learned the ranch the way you learned a person, in pieces, over time, with the understanding that what you learned first was not necessarily the most important thing. She knew the south pasture's color markers now. She knew that the east fence line had a weak section near the creek crossing that Gideon rebuilt every spring because the flooding undermined it every winter, and that he did this without complaint because it was simply what the land required. She knew that he woke early, earlier than she did, and that his first hour of the day was the quietest he would be, and that this was not moodiness, but simply the way his mind came back to itself in the morning. She knew that he still went to the kitchen garden on Thursday evenings and weeded the beds, even now that she'd learned enough from Ruth Kavanaugh's neighbor, who turned out to have an encyclopedic knowledge of kitchen gardens, to tell him which things were weeds and which were coming back on their own schedule. On the Sunday in the third week of April, when the garden showed the first real green, she was on the porch with her coffee when he came around the corner of the house and stopped and looked at the herb corner with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not grief. Not the weight of grief. Something quieter and more complicated. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular feeling of a thing you've been tending finally showing you that it worked. "They're back," he said. She could see them from the porch. Small, determined, the particular gray-green of sage, and the darker pointed growth of what she'd learned was thyme, pushing up through the cut-back stems from last fall. "They always come back," she said. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to learn what they are, properly. What to do with them." He said it to the garden, not to her, but she understood it was for her. She'd want them used, not just kept. "Ruth Kavanaugh's neighbor," Clara said. "Mrs. Peterson. She offered, when I asked her about the weeding." He turned and looked at her. "You asked someone?" "I asked someone," she said, "because you said you didn't know what you were doing, and I thought someone should find out." She paused. "I probably should have told you I did that." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was evaluating something. "No," he said. That's exactly the right thing to have done." She had expected to feel relief at his reaction. What she felt instead was something more settled and less anxious than relief. Just the simple recognition that they were building the same thing from both sides, and that their instincts about what it needed were running more or less parallel. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The question of what their situation was, what to call it, how to name it to other people, resolved itself with the particular gracelessness of most things that resolve themselves in small towns. Ruth Kavanaugh had known since February. Howard Briggs had worked it out from the Sunday rides. Thomas had needed no information because he had eyes and had already come to Clara on a morning in late March and said, with the directness of the young, "He's doing better. I know it's because of you. I wanted to say thank you, even though I don't think he'd want me to." Clara had told him it wasn't necessary. "I know," Thomas said. "I wanted to anyway." She'd thought about that for a while after, about the difference between things that were necessary and things that were wanted, and how the wanted things were often the more important ones. The surveying dispute had produced one useful secondary effect. Ed Harlow had gone noticeably quiet. Not because he'd become a better person, Clara doubted that, but because he'd spent money and time on a losing effort and had nothing to show for it, and the county assessor now knew his name in an unflattering context. He still came into the station occasionally, still bought tickets with the proprietary ease he brought to everything, but he did not lean on the counter and he did not make observations about Clara's personal life or Gideon's property. Clara considered this a workable outcome. Not every problem in life was solved by the person who caused it becoming a better person. Sometimes they just stopped because stopping was cheaper than continuing. She had learned this from her years caring for her parents, that some battles resolved not through insight but through exhaustion, and that this was all right because the resolution was real either way. On a Friday in May, something happened on the platform that had not happened in the entire 7 months of their Fridays. The bench was wet from an afternoon shower, not the cold, relentless rain of October, but a proper spring rain, warm and brief, already drying at the edges. And Clara had not brought the wool blanket because it was finally, actually, warm enough not to need it. She brought the coffee. She sat down. She waited. Gideon arrived at 3:20, same as always, took his cup, sat beside her. They watched the tracks. "I've been thinking," he said at 3:35. "All right," she said. "About what comes next," he said. "Practically speaking." She waited. "The ranch is going to need help," he said. "Come fall, when I'm bringing in new stock, I'm going to need another set of hands. I've been talking to Thomas about it. He's been talking about whether he wants to stay in Blackstone Crossing or go to Wichita, and I told him the decision was his, but that if he stayed, there'd be work." He paused. "He's thinking about staying." "That's good," Clara said. "It is," he said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands once. "I've also been thinking about the practical problem of—" He stopped. "Of what this is. Between us. In terms of what the town sees and what the arrangements actually are." He stopped again. She looked at him. He was looking at the tracks with the expression of a man who is delivering a speech he has rehearsed and finds the rehearsal was not adequate preparation. "Gideon," she said, "Are you trying to ask me to marry you?" she said. "Because if you are, you can just do that." He turned and looked at her. "I'm not going to do it on a bench," he said. "Why not?" she said. "The bench is where we're honest with each other." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light in May was different from every other month, more direct, less apologetic, finding its way across the platform at a low angle that made everything look like it was being paid attention to. "All right," he said. "Yes, that's what I'm trying to do." She held his gaze. "Then do it," she said quietly. He set his coffee cup down on the bench arm. He turned toward her, which required a certain physical awkwardness on the bench that neither of them pretended wasn't there. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had learned to read as carefully as any document she'd worked with in her professional life. "I know this isn't simple," he said. "I know I come with a ranch that's still rebuilding and a dead wife who is woven into every wall of my house, and a nephew who will have opinions, and a kitchen garden that requires more knowledge than either of us currently has." He paused. "And I know I'm not the man I was when Rosalie was alive. I'm a different version of him. Less certain about a lot of things. More careful." Another pause. "I don't know if that's worse. I think it might not be." Clara did not say anything. She waited. "I'd like to keep doing this," he said. "Everything that this has been. The Fridays and the Sundays and the coffee and the honest things. I'd like to keep doing it officially, if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had sat on a bench for 3 years waiting for something he knew would never come, and had kept coming anyway because the alternative was forgetting the sharpness of what he'd had, and had then one rainy October afternoon been asked a question by a woman who had no business asking it and had answered her honestly and had been answering her honestly ever since. "I'm willing," she said. He reached out and took her hand the same way he'd done in the kitchen in February. Not dramatically, just with the certainty of a man who has decided something and is done being uncertain about it. Rosalie said, "Stop being a fool," he said. Rosalie was right, Clara said. They sat on the bench until the eastbound came in. They watched it together, as they had every Friday since October. The passengers came off. New faces, always new faces. The endless traffic of people going somewhere and arriving somewhere and leaving something behind. The noise and the steam and the indifferent rush of the world moving through. And when the last passenger stepped off and the platform went quiet, Clara watched Gideon do the thing he had done every Friday for 3 years. She watched him track the last door. She watched what moved through him. This time it was different, not gone. She did not expect it to be gone, and she did not want it to be. Rosalie Ashcroft had run the length of this platform with 2 bags in her hands and no concern for who was watching, and that had happened, and it was real, and a man who stopped feeling the absence of that would be a smaller man than the one Clara had chosen. But what passed through him and what he did with it, that was different now. She watched him put it somewhere that was not suppression and not denial, but something more like what you did with a thing you had finally found the right place to keep. Not hidden, not forgotten, placed. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. "Still the hardest part?" she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "But it's—" He stopped. "The weight of it is different. It doesn't feel like sinking anymore." "No," she said, "it doesn't." They married on a Saturday in late September, in the small clapboard building at the edge of Blackstone Crossing that served as the town's general gathering place for occasions that required one. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Clara had not wanted elaborate. She had spent her 20s and early 30s in a house where the emphasis was always on managing what was diminishing, and she had developed a lasting preference for things that were functional and real over things that were ornate and managed. She wore a dress she'd had made in Wichita. Good wool, dark blue, the color of sky before weather, which she'd chosen without conscious intention and then recognized later. She carried nothing. Thomas had offered to ride to Lawrence for flowers, and she had told him it was a kind offer and unnecessary, and he had looked slightly relieved, which told her something about Thomas's attitude toward unnecessary trips to Lawrence. Ruth Cavanaugh sat in the front row and cried, which she had stated in advance she intended to do, and which she did with the unapologetic efficiency of a woman who has decided to feel her feelings regardless of what they look like. Howard Briggs attended with his wife and wore an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though things had resolved themselves in accordance with his private expectations, which Clara suspected they had. Mrs. Peterson, who had come out to the ranch twice in April to teach them the kitchen garden, sat near the back and brought a jar of her own preserves as a gift, which Clara found so perfect that she had to press her lips together for a moment to stay composed. Ed Harlow did not attend. No one commented on this. Thomas sat beside Gideon at the front and managed, for the duration of the ceremony, not to offer any opinions about ranch management or property values, or the long-term projections for the cattle market, which Clara considered a genuine act of love from a 23-year-old who was not naturally inclined towards silence. The ceremony was short and direct. The words were plain. Neither of them had wanted long speeches or elaborate vows. They had been talking honestly to each other on a bench for 7 months, and they had already said most of what there was to say. What they said publicly was simple, that they chose each other, that they intended to keep choosing each other, that love was not a thing that arrived complete and stayed that way, but something you decided on, repeatedly, in the ordinary moments and the hard ones and the ones in between. Gideon held her hand during the whole of it, the way he'd held it in the kitchen in February and on the bench in May. Not tightly, not with the clinging quality of anxiety, just with the steadiness of a man who had decided he was not going to keep putting things down. Afterward, the small crowd moved through to the main room for food that half the town seemed to have contributed without being asked, which was the particular superpower of small communities, and one of the things Clara had come to value about Blackstone Crossing in a way she hadn't expected when she'd arrived 7 months ago with a trunk and a job offer and a still grief she didn't know what to do with. At some point in the early evening, when the food was mostly gone and the conversation had settled into the comfortable ambient noise of people who knew each other well enough to talk about nothing in particular, Gideon found her beside the window. He handed her a cup of coffee. She took it. "I want to go to the station," he said. She looked at him. "It's our wedding day," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to go anyway." She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had sat on a bench for 3 years and been asked a question that cracked something open, and had answered it honestly, and had kept answering it, and was standing here now with coffee and a simple, direct request. "All right," she said. They slipped out without announcement, which was easy enough in the comfortable noise of a room full of people, and walked together down the main street of Blackstone Crossing in the late September evening, which was cool but not cold, the kind of September that reminded you that October was possible without entirely being October yet. The station was closed. The platform was empty. The gas lamp at the far end was lit, as it always was after dark, making a small yellow circle in the larger dark. Gideon had a key. He'd had one since Howard Briggs had simply given him one sometime in December, with no explanation beyond the practical observation that it was inconvenient to lock up when someone was still sitting on the bench. Clara had found out about this key in March and had not expressed a view on it, because some things were between a man and a station master and didn't require her commentary. He unlocked the platform gate and they walked out onto the boards. The bench was there. The same bench. The same weathered wood, the grain worn smooth in the place where Gideon had sat every Friday for 3 years. The same slight tilt to the left that they'd both stopped noticing months ago. They sat down. Not with coffee this time, not with any particular purpose. They just sat on the bench in the September dark, and Clara looked at the tracks curving east toward Lawrence and Kansas City and everything beyond, and she thought about all the Fridays that had happened on this platform and all the ones that would happen after. She thought about what the bench was. Not what it had started as, a grief marker, a place of faithful, painful return, but what it had become in the months of their Fridays. A place where things got said that needed saying. A place where two people who had been very good at being alone had learned, slowly and badly, and with no particular grace, how to be something else. She thought about what it meant to show up to a place that cost you something, week after week, and to keep showing up even when the cost didn't diminish. She thought that Gideon had done that for 3 years out of devotion to what he'd lost, and had done it for the last 7 months out of something she could only call courage, the quiet, unheroic kind, the kind that didn't announce itself but simply kept going. She thought, I came to Blackstone Crossing to breathe. She thought, I stayed because the breathing turned into something else. She thought, that is a thing worth knowing about yourself, that you can arrive in a place for one reason and discover it is yours for an entirely different one. What are you thinking? Gideon said. She considered telling him something brief. Instead, she told him the truth. That I'm glad Martha Greer called you a waste of a seat, she said, because if she hadn't, I might not have looked out the window that first Friday. He was quiet for a moment. That might be the best thing Martha Greer ever did for anyone, he said. Unknowingly, Clara said. The best things usually are, he said. They sat in the quiet of the empty platform, and somewhere down the eastern tracks the sound of a distant train was audible. Not the eastbound, which had come and gone hours ago, but a freight, running late into the night, the low rumble of it reaching them before the light did. Gideon heard it too. She felt the slight change in him when he heard it, the old reflexive attention. But he didn't track toward the curve in the tracks the way he used to. He stayed where he was, with her, and let the sound come and go. I'm going to bring wildflowers next week, he said, after the sound faded. Friday morning, before the train. I want to bring something. For her. He paused. Not instead of coming, just in addition to it. Clara thought about what that meant. About a man who had been keeping an obligation for 3 years, learning the difference between obligation and devotion, and deciding that devotion could hold 2 people at once without diminishing either. I'll leave the coffee on the bench before you get there, she said. You don't have to do that anymore, he said. You work there. It's different now. I know it's different, she said. I want to do it anyway. He looked at her. She looked back. Rosalie said, stop being a fool, she said. She didn't say stop being you. After a moment, he put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it. They sat on the bench that had held the weight of 3 years of grief and 7 months of slowly choosing something different, and the September night settled around them, cool and real and particular, and the lamp at the end of the platform made its small yellow circle in the dark. The bench was just a bench. It was also everything that had happened on it. Both things were true. That was the thing about places that held real weight. They didn't stop being what they were because something new had happened there. They just became more. The grief and the coffee and the dried herb sprig and the questions that shouldn't have been asked and the answers given anyway and the letter mailed on a Tuesday morning and a hand taken in a kitchen in February and 2 people sitting in the September dark on their wedding night because they wanted to be where things had started. All of it layered together. All of it real. All of it part of the same story. Clara had come to Blackstone Crossing not knowing what she was looking for. She had found, on a rainy Friday afternoon, a man who was faithful to something he'd lost. And she had asked him a question, and he had answered her honestly, and everything after that had been the 2 of them deciding, over and over, in small moments and hard ones, to keep doing that. She thought, that is what love actually looks like. Not the arrival of it, the choosing of it. The ordinary, repeated, imperfect act of choosing it again tomorrow and the day after and the Friday after that. She thought, I know how to do that. She thought, I've been doing it since October. The distant freight moved away down the tracks toward whatever was east of here, and the night went quiet, and the bench held them both without complaint, as it had always held whatever was brought to it, and the lamp at the end of the platform kept its small, patient light. That was enough. That was, as someone had once decided on a winter afternoon in 1871 and spent 3 weeks stitching into cloth, exactly enough.